Hello YouTube audience. This video is going to be about a brief review of a 2014 VW or Volkswagen Passat. This is the B7 generation. Let's have a quick walk around the vehicle. This is the 1.8 liter inline 4 turbo engine version or platforms available for this B7 Passat. The other platform or engine version available for this B7 Passat would be the 2.5 liter inline 5 naturally aspirated non-turbo engine. One of the first things you'll notice with this engine is that the cam timing is a chain timing system, not a belt timing system. The chain should last a whole lot longer than a belt timing system. One of the other key things you'll notice with this inline 4 1.8 liter turbo engine is that this is a direct injection system where the fuel rail and fuel injectors sits below the manifold and spray fuel directly into the cylinders. The 2.5 liter inline 5 version, the engine version for this vehicle, is port injected. So one of the biggest thing with the direct injection system is that you'll have carbon buildup on the intake manifolds. You can prolong that with a catch can. As you see here, this is routed on top of the cyclonic oil separator. One of the PCV vents is an inlet and an outlet that goes back into the intake right before the turbo inlet. The other problem besides the carbon buildup on the intake valves that would eventually cause misfires on cold starts and misfires in general and rough idles and things of that nature is that you'll notice the high pressure fuel pump and fuel rail here, and you have the fuel pump, the in-tank fuel pump as well. The direct injection system, the fuel pressure could be anywhere from, it's over 1,000, it's around 1,400 psi, versus a port injected would be around 30, 35, 40, 50, 60 psi. So it's a huge difference there. It's always a constant computer fluctuation of the fuel pressure and many variations on the fuel pressure, which causes the fuel pump to go bad or premature much faster than a fuel pump that is port injected. For instance, this vehicle here has 90,000 miles. I had to replace the fuel pump, the in-tank fuel pump, and the fuel pump control module, which usually gets hot under the seat. I've replaced both at only 90,000 miles. I have had other vehicles when I was much younger, a Nissan Altima, which is also an inline 4, and that's a 2.4 liter naturally aspirated with port injection system, and I've had 249,077 miles with no problems. Never had to replace a fuel pump or fuel injectors. So back to the subject here. For the 2.5 liter inline 5 version is port injected. You don't have to worry about the carbon buildup on the intake valves because fuel is a good solvent. It will clean that out. The other key thing with this vehicle is the transmission. It is a 6-speed automatic transmission. Transmission these days have a lot of crazy names. I believe this is the 09G. It is not a CVT. You want to stay away from the CVT transmission, though, the continuously variable transmission or something of that sort. Those are chain driven transmission. They don't have gears. You have a lot of lag from a stop, and it's just not very reliable in a sense. You just want to stick with the standard automatic transmission. I do not know if this is a dual clutch or a torque converter. I didn't look into that much detail, but it doesn't really make a big difference if that's just shift timing. The dual clutch or the torque converter, you're talking something with 200 horsepower or just under. Those things are not going to make a difference. This is an everyday, daily car. Just like the fuel injectors, direct fuel injection system here, where it can fluctuate for the engine to burn fuel more proficiently, which in turn should save fuel. But really, for a daily driver, you don't really need injection. I think that causes more problems in the long run versus trying to save fuel. Very little fuel, if any, for a car that's already a small engine. And that the other problem with replacing these or cleaning the valves, you have to pull out the intake manifold, and usually when you pull these out, for this particular engine, I don't think the injectors have to come off, but for some of the Audis and other VWs, the Golf or the GTI, or other version, don't quote me on it, but other version, when you pull out the intake manifold, the fuel injectors sometimes come out of the block. And what the problems you run into with that is that the seals goes bad. You have to replace the seals when the injectors come out, and you need a special tool for that. Or you can get a whole new injector, which is the direct injection fuel injectors. You're looking at around $250 versus port injection fuel injectors. Those can go anywhere from $50, $70, $100. So it's a huge difference in price as well. And you do have to replace injectors if they do come out of the block, or replace the seals, and they can be $250 a piece, like I said. So that's another problem that you run into with the direct injection system. So you're going to be replacing the fuel pump more often. You're going to be replacing the fuel injectors more often. It's just ridiculous. Just like the auto start system on those Mercedes and other vehicles, where you're sitting at a light, the engine shut off and come on. You're constantly demanding the starter to work, which in turn will prematurely wear it out, and you have to replace the starter. You got to sit down and think about it. The resources it takes to manufacture a fuel injector, to manufacture fuel pumps, to manufacture starters, the amount of resources it takes for production, for transport to the consumers, to put on the shelf, to put in the warehouse, the dealership, available for the consumers to buy. How much resources does that burn? How much energy does that burn? Is it really worth having this system? And also, you're going to spend a lot of money at the dealership if you don't do these yourself. I do these myself, but you will become a sucker or an idiot or a fool or like a lamb or a sheep at these dealerships, where they will drain your wallet very, very, very quick. So the transmission here, as I said, is not a CVT. It's a 6-speed automatic. Again, I don't know if it's dual clutch or torque converter. It doesn't make a big difference. It's a very low horsepower car. You can drain the system yourself and fill it yourself without the craziness of pumping it through the drain plug. Let me get a bore scope and show you where the fill plug is for this engine. Alright, so there is the fill plug right at the front of the transmission, above the drain pan. Maybe you can see it, but it's right at the front. There's a torque screw. That is a drain plug because I've taken it out before, and I pump a ATF automatic transmission fluid right through there, and it instantly came out the drain hole. Now, you have to be careful with, let me put this away. Okay, as I was saying, you have to be careful with the CVT transmission. I did a printout here on my notepad so I can show you. For the CVT transmission, it does have a drain plug on the transmission as well, and also a Torx looking fill plug, but that is not a automatic transmission fluid fill plug. That is actually at the front compartment of the CVT transmission, and that's a whole separate compartment. There's a front and the back. The front here is for the gear oil, so there is no fill plug for the CVT transmission, no automatic transmission fluid fill plug, but there is a gear oil fill plug for the CVT transmission. So you don't want to add ATF through there, only gear oil. And when you refill the automatic transmission fluid, you have to use a special pump to pump that up for the CVT transmission. As I've printed out here to show you, you got to use this system. As you see, there's a back compartment and the front compartment for the CVT transmission. You do have a drain plug there, and the fill plug here, that's the gear oil fill plug, whole separate compartment. When I did it here, I've showed you here with some mirror, that is the gear oil fill plug. There is no fill plug for the CVT transmission. But here, this is not a CVT, this is a 6-speed automatic. I was just referring to the notes there to compare the CVT versus an automatic transmission. What do you have to watch out for? That is not a fill plug. Now, as I've showed you with the bore scope, there is a automatic transmission fluid fill plug at the front of the transmission above the drain pan, and there looks like there is a fill plug up here as well, but I've never loosened that to check. But I know for a fact that the front is an automatic transmission fluid. And the way you do this without fancy tools to check transmission fluid temperature, what comes out, you put back in exactly what comes out, and factoring in what's the fluid that's in the tubes of the pump that you're using as well. Now, the other way to really check it is, number one, you want to add back in exactly what came out, factoring in the fluid that's on the pump tubing mechanism that you use. And the other method that I use as well is I write down the RPM range at cruising speed at 45 miles per hour, at 60 miles per hour, and at 80 miles per hour on a level surface at cruising speed. Take a note of your RPM. For instance, my RPM at 80 miles per hour is 2200 RPM. So if you have too much fluid, you're gonna be revving high at cruising speed. You have too low of fluid, the transmission it's not gonna want to go, it's not gonna want to accelerate. So that's one of the ways you can keep track of the fluid level without fancy tools, correct fluid levels without fancy, temperature tools. Thing about the transmission, the automatic transmission for this generation of B7 Passat, the 6-speed, is that it is also known to have a solenoid failure on the valve body of the transmission. I believe the 7 solenoid, the 6-speed, and also the reverse solenoid as well. When the solenoid goes bad, you'll feel a rough upshift and a rough downshift between the gears. It can be second to third gear, first, fourth, fifth, sixth, whichever solenoid is going bad, you're going to have a rough upshift and a rough downshift between the gears. And they're not that very difficult to replace. You just have to remove the drain pan, remove some electrical sockets, and the valve body bolts. Take out the whole valve body, and the solenoid sits with the valve body and is held on with some pins, and you can replace them that way. So that is known to have an issue with the transmission. So besides what I already covered, the direct injection system with the fuel injectors and the fuel rail and the carbon buildup on the intake, you can prolong that with a catch can. Now, I've seen other catch can system on the market where you have to do all sorts of nuts and bolts to even take out or remove the catch can to drain it out. The catch can system I have here, you just twist loose with an O-ring. It has an O-ring that seals it, and you just twist loose. That's the most simple way. You want, something with durability. You don't want any crazy fittings on these here, or rubber fittings and self at home type thing. If you do, make sure you do it with reliability and durability in mind with these catch cans. You don't want to go too crazy. Now, besides the direct injection and the transmission and the fuel pump that was replaced, the fuel pump that I replaced with this vehicle, in this vehicle, you want to use good oil. It is a 5W40 weight oil. The 5 number and the 40 number, that's just an oil flow rate at, I believe, 210 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a cold start rate above the number before the W. So it's a 5 flow rate when it's cold start, and then it goes to 40 when it's warmed up. So that's the correct oil weight you want to use for this particular vehicle. They say you should change your oil every 10,000 miles if it's synthetic. I do mine every between 5,000 and 7,000 miles. That can also help reduce the carbon buildup on these engines as well. Some people might say that's wasteful to change the oil faster than the recommended mileage, but I'll tell you what's wasteful. Every time the president travel is wasteful. All the resources, how many troopers and deputies and officers and secret servicemen and government officials has to travel with the president in 2 weeks in advance before he goes somewhere. Every time he travels, that's a huge waste of resource. The another example, a lot of these new cars that comes out every year, the manufacturing of new cars, the amount of new cars that are sold every year that are manufactured every year, that's wasteful. People keep switching cars every year because there's no pride in ownership. That people just lease them and toss them out, and they don't have to worry about any of these issues because they only expect 10, 20, 30, 40,000, 60,000 miles out of a vehicle, and they'll trash them and switch them out or expect you to crash them. But for all my vehicles, I get 200,000-300,000 miles out of them, between 200,000 and 300,000 miles. And to also maintain it, besides the oil, the spark plugs is recommended that you change every 60,000 miles. I do them between every 30 and 50,000 miles on the spark plugs. These are, for this particular B7 Passat, the factory VW spark plugs that they use. I'm not certain which brand they use, but the gap on them for the standard factory OEM spark plugs, the gap is 0.032. So if you gap them correctly, the torque on them is higher than usual. Usually people just snug fit them. Other vehicles that I had, they're usually around 13 foot-pounds, but these VWs, Audis, even Mercedes, they're around 22 foot-pounds of torque for the spark plugs. And you just make sure you grease everything up correctly, dielectric grease, and you don't want to use thread locker on the spark plug. You want to use the anti-seize on the spark plugs. Make sure you do everything the correct way, torque everything down. And the spark plugs, the motor oil, there's no power steering fluid on this because it's not a hydraulic system. It's an electronic power steering system. That's why you don't see a power steering reservoir on this vehicle. You do see a brake reservoir, and you should drain that out or flush or bleed out the brake system every time you change the pad or every 60,000 miles or so. Also the coolant as well. You don't want to cause rust and things like that in the coolant lines, and you can prematurely wear out your water pump. And the windshield wash, that's not a big deal. So those are the things you want to look out for. You want to check your oil. And on around me, I had to keep coming back and forth to the video, but you want to check your oil level at a level surface. Make sure you have adequate oil because it does burn oil. Every 1,000 miles or so, or every 3 or 4 fill up that you do at the gas station, you want to check your oil. Now you cannot, unfortunately, like I said, you cannot check your transmission fluid level. You have to add in exactly what comes out. Keep track of your RPM ranges at cruising speed. Make sure you have the correct amount of automatic transmission fluid in there. There's no dipstick for it. Now, if you have a vehicle that has a dipstick for it, you want to warm up the motor to operating temperature, be at a level surface, and leave the motor running while you check the automatic transmission fluid dipstick. For this vehicle, the Passat B7 does not have the dipstick. Okay, that I've basically discuss some of the things about modern engine and the direct injection systems. I did not cover about the valve, the modern engine valve system. There are variable valve timing, like the VTEC system or the system in the G35s, the variable valve timing system on the G35, or the VTEC system as in Honda Civics. And this does have, I did put in a boost gauge. This is a boost tap that goes onto the intake manifold. Make sure, if you do decide to do this, make sure the engine and the intake manifold, the plastic intake manifold here, is up to temperature and hot when you puncture the intake manifold, because you don't want to prevent cracking on the intake manifold before you put in this boost tap. It runs along the back inside to the firewall. I also do have a Stop Tech rotor system on this vehicle. It is slotted, not drilled. You usually want to avoid drilled to prevent cracking in the future, because drill rotors will crack on you eventually. Let me get the torque specs for them for you. Okay, take a look in at the torque specs here. The wheel lug nudge is 103 foot-pounds, or 140 Newton meters. And this is the front brake for this Passat B7. Passat B7, it's a front brake. The torque specs for them is here. The caliper bracket, 147 foot-pounds. The ABS sensor is 6 foot-pounds. The little screw that holds the rotor in place is 3 foot-pounds. And the caliper pins are 22 foot-pounds. You get a good view of it here. To the interior of the vehicle. Oh, one last thing. If you do decide to remove the intake manifold to clean the intake valves, the carbon buildup on the intake valves, when you just be very gentle as you loosen all of these fuel lines and the sockets here, also the support bracket, and the, I believe there's going to be a coolant sensor socket down there, so you guys have to be careful taking all of these apart while you're doing it. And when you're putting it back together, while you clean the intake valves, make sure you do them one at a time. You turn the crank manually. Turn the crank manually clockwise. Make sure all both intake valves are closed for each cylinder. Then clean them out individually. When you do put them back together, these bolts from the intake manifold to the block is 9 Newton meters. First, you just want to snug them individually and crisscross them, and then go back and torque them down at 9 Newton meters. You want to go back and torque them down at 9 Newton meters, and then you'll be good to go. And the fuel line, make sure you snug them. You don't have any leak when you do the carbon cleanup on the intake valves for this vehicle. Moving on to the interior. A lot of leg room. I do have the WeatherTech system on the vehicle. The rear engine compartment, the rear passenger compartment of the vehicle. Abundant leg room. Now keep in mind, this vehicle has 93,000 miles, and I have given over 2,800 lifts ride. I'll show you at the end of the video. I'm not joking. Also, the trunk space for this vehicle. abundant trunk space. Trunk space is not an issue with this vehicle. Lots of cargo room. Spare tire and a jack system there. Now for the hitch, this is from eTrailer.com. They make custom hitches for vehicles. Their price are very ethical. I would highly recommend them if you're looking for a bicycle hitch. I installed those myself. They do come with instructions and torque specs. And let me show you real quick. This is with the front seat all the way back. So see here, see the front seat's all the way to the back. And look how much leg room there is. That's amazing how much leg room there are. All right, let's move on to the interior. Now I did put in a boost gauge. This is an electronic boost gauge, not a mechanical boost gauge. So I did put in the boost gauge because from the factory, this vehicle is lacking a boost gauge. So you do not know how much pressure the turbo is putting out on inside the intake manifold without a boost gauge. And there's no digital boost gauge as well that comes with the factory. That's the reason I installed this gauge. The pod here, of course, like all aftermarket part, is not a perfect fit. I had to dip it in boiling water and mold it and shape it to fit nicely behind the steering wheel. And the way I wired it is through here. As you see, the boost line came through the firewall underneath. But for this here, the way it's wired, all you gotta do is turn this a little bit, push down, and it'll come right out. So this is the socket here. I'm not gonna take it all the way out with one hand, but as you see, it's wired. I wired everything. Disconnect the socket, pull it out here so you have room to work with. And with the coloring of the wiring, just make sure that, you know, whatever instruction that came with the gauge, it doesn't have to match the coloring. Just make sure that you tap into the wires that match the location on the socket, and make sure it's the same type of socket. The most important wire would be the ground wire, which I solder. I solder the ground wire because that's the most important wire. Without good ground, all your wires will fry. All the power wires, I just tap into it. It's not a big deal. Use shrink tubing, you know, solder it together, and then cloth, electrical tape, make everything looks nice. Okay, back to the interior. Yeah, this is a first responder kit. It has a CPR mask in here, but like I said, I've given over 2,800 rides, lift ride with this vehicle, and this is the condition that is in. Let's check the compression, show you the compression reading. So you can tell with is an electrical boost gauge because it will run through its course, the needle all the way from the lowest point to the highest point, because an electrical or mechanical gauge will not do that. It would just go directly, the boost line would go directly into the gauge. This boost line goes to a little electronic controller that came with the gauge, and then it plugs into that module, and then you wire it to the socket. As you see, I have good compression. Any reading between 18 and 22 for vacuum is a healthy reading. I have the reading chart here. Vacuum reading is actually more important than the boost reading. So that's the other reason that I got this boost vacuum gauge, that I installed this on the vehicle. So the light does work with the switch. Do have good compression. The gauge light, that is. Okay, going back to when I mentioned about the StopTech rotors. The reason behind I put that on is because when I brake really hard or apply heavy braking on this vehicle at highway speed, the wheel would vibrate really bad. That's even with a really, a healthy wheel bearing, healthy ball joint, healthy sway bar link, sway bar bushing, steering rack, tie rod, lower upper control arm. Everything was up to stuff, but it still vibrate. But ever since I put these slotted rotors on from StopTech, when I apply heavy braking, the same scenario, no pulsation, no vibration when hard braking, when the ABS engages. Maybe it's because of the way that the slotted is vented. The slotted section allows air to expand or something between the pads. I'm not too certain, but I went with the slotted rotors and it got rid of the pulsating ABS braking. Now, you don't want to cheap out on the rotors and use, unknown name brand on Amazon or eBay or what have you. You don't want to cheap out on the rotors. I got StopTech because, number one, their price are very ethical. They're not the cheapest, they're not the most expensive, but they're track proven. Their rotors are nicely mill balanced, so there's no vibration at highway speeds. And I got the slotted over the drill, as I said before, because drill will eventually crack on you. I've had drill rotors before. Now, this is not the case for all vehicles. There's an Audi vehicle A4 that doesn't have that issue. There's other vehicles out there, Mercedes, the CTS-V, doesn't have those ABS issues when you apply heavy braking. But for this particular Passat B7, there is heavy ABS pulsation, and when I put the StopTech slotted rotor system at the front brakes, the pulsating almost completely went away. And one last thing I want to mention, oh yes, about the fuel pump. Let me go to the back seat. All right, we're at the back seat. So the fuel pump is located on the passenger rear side. You just pop this loose, like so. Go to the other side and come back. You basically pull the front loose and then push it back a little bit and then lift forward, and it will lift this whole rear seat up. And there is the fuel pump control module. You twist this a little bit, the fuel pump sits right underneath this. And there's a twist lid. You get a flat screwdriver or something that's similar. You just tap it loose and make sure you mark, where you had it last, about the same area. You just want to snug fit it, and you don't want any fuel and vapors leaking through there. But you do want to snug it. Also, you don't want to compress the fuel pump into the tank, to the bottom of the tank too much. So That's the fuel pump. This is fuel engine control module on the back seat. Put back together correctly. There's an arrow. Put the seat back in. Slide it and snug it. Do the other side and we're good to go. Alright guys, please thumbs up this vehicle. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a better understanding and more informed about the 2014 B7 Passat or B7 generation Volkswagen Passat. All right, there's a few last notes that I want to mention about is in regards to saving fuel with the direct injection system or the auto start system. The problem with those, like I said, you know, my opinion on is if you already have an inline 4 vehicle, front wheel drive, you know, with less components already port injected, and if you have a grocery getter car, you know, inline 4 front wheel drive, like as something similar to this, if you have high gears, for instance, this vehicle has 6 gears. So if you have 7, 8, 9, 10 gears at highway speed or cruising speed, you know, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour on the highway, 60, 70, 80, and you have a lot of gears, you are gonna be at a lower RPM. Thus, you are saving fuel. If you don't have that much gear, if you only have 4-speed or 5-speed, like back in the day with the automatic transmission, you are burning more gas because you'll be at a high RPM. But with the higher gears, you are capable, or you are able to cruise at a low RPM. You are saving gas. Thus, it's really unnecessary to have a direct injection system or an auto start where you're saving minimal fuel by having the computer, you know, burn fuel more smartly, or saving fuel at an idle at a stoplight. I think you'll save more fuel with higher gears and being able to cruise at a lower RPM. And again, like I mentioned, with those problems with the direct injection, you know, your fuel injectors will have to be replaced more often, your fuel pump will have to be replaced more often, and the carbon buildup on the intake, you know, all those things require much more money and is very unnecessary. You have to think about it. You have to sit down and think about it. The auto start, you got to replace a starter much faster. You have to sit down and think about the amount of time and resources it takes to produce those parts and have it delivered and transport to be available for consumers. Are you really saving, you know, the earth or saving resources? So you really have to question yourself about that. And also with the new trend, there's a lot of these, you know, fake vents, fake front grille, fake rear vents on the exhaust, fake exhaust tips, the cheap touchscreen monitor that they put on cars these days, the electronic doors outside to get in the vehicle. Those things, you know, break. That's just more things to go wrong. You know, something like a touch knob like this is going to last the whole life of the vehicle. You know, not the cheap touchscreen stuff or the fake AC or fan vents. Those things are just silly in my opinion. You know, but you can have your own opinion, you can have your own taste, but to me, I would never buy a vehicle with something like that. Also, the last thing here, let's go back. The last things that I want to mention real quick in regards to the catch can and what I said about the transmission. So the catch can system, make sure you get a system that doesn't cancel out the cyclonic oil separator on your engine. Because, for instance, if you have 2 PCV going out, one high pressure, one low pressure, so I've seen some catch can system that actually will plug out or block off one PCV port, either the high pressure or the low pressure, and you don't want to do that. I think that's not a good idea because the car wasn't designed that way. You might run into some problems with leak or you know, any problems that I might not be aware of. But I would not cancel that. I would get a system that keeps the cyclonic oil separator and doesn't cancel out any PCV port. And, you know, get a twist-on system with an O-ring, not something crazy where you have to unbolt and do all sorts of crazy stuff just to empty out your can. And in regards to the transmission, all right, in regards to the transmission, again, this is not a CVT transmission, but I want to make clear what I said about the CVT transmission. The CVT transmission does have a drain plug at the back of the transmission, and what looks like a fuel plug at the front of the CVT transmission, it is not a fuel plug. Remember, that is a gear oil, which is a totally separate compartment within the CVT transmission. The CVT transmission in the back, make sure you do not fill it with ATF, automatic transmission fluid. Make sure you fill it with a special CVT transmission fluid that is the correct product number or part number for your vehicle. I just want to make that clear. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up with some photos at the end of the video. Again, thank you for watching. I hope I was able to enlighten you or make you more informed of modern day engines and its components, and in particular this Passat B7 Volkswagen 1.8 turbo. Mention, you know, there is another engine platform for this that is 2.5 liter inline 5 port injected, and you do not have the turbo. You don't have to worry about the carbon buildup with the direct injection. You don't have to worry about the diverter valve going bad, or, you know, the turbo bearings wearing out. You know, there's just less things to worry about. But there's pros and cons in turbo and non-turbo. But usually you want to stay from CVT transmission and direct injection if you can help it. What you want to do is what you would rather prefer is a port injection or dual injected. That way you don't have to worry about cleaning your intake valves. All right, that's it. And I understand about the emission, why they implemented the direct injection system, but really in comparison to an inline 4 port injected with a catalyst and a pre-cat or the EGR system, there's really no big difference in emission that's being dumped into the atmosphere. The exhaust gas is really very, very close, I would say. You know, the direct injection system, I think it creates more problems with the carbon buildup and the injector replacements and fuel pump plate. Those things takes more resources. In theory, you know, they're supposed to work. They're supposed to cut down on emission, save a little bit more fuel, but practically, I don't think there's a big difference with the port injected inline 4 front wheel drive engine. If you have a lot of gears, again, you can cruise at a low RPM and thus in turn saving gas, saving fuel or petrol or oil. I think that's better in the long run versus something like this where, you know, there's constant cleaning, constant replacement of parts. That's more so than a car that is inline 4 front wheel drive port injected with higher gears. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. Cheers. All right, this sums up my video. I hope you have a blessed morning, afternoon, evening, or night.